Every fermented food explained. Somewhere around 10,000 years ago, a human being left some food out too long, and instead of throwing it away, decided to eat it anyway. That decision built civilizations. It's a strange thing to owe your bread, your cheese, your soy sauce, and your morning coffee to a mistake. But here we are, and the mistake never stopped paying dividends. Fermentation is, at its core, controlled decay. You're inviting bacteria, yeast, or mold to break your food down before it can rot on its own terms, and in exchange for letting them eat first, they leave behind alcohol, acid, or gas that makes the food last longer, taste sharper, and sometimes turn into something almost unrecognizable from where it started. It's less a cooking technique than a negotiated peace treaty with microorganisms, and humans figured out the terms of that treaty independently on nearly every continent without ever comparing notes. Let's start with the one most people already have an opinion about: sauerkraut, cabbage, salt, and thyme. That's the entire ingredient list, and it's been that way since Chinese laborers building the Great Wall were reportedly fermenting cabbage in rice wine over 2,000 years ago, a practice that later moved west along trade routes and eventually landed in Central Europe, where it became a staple hearty enough to survive winters that killed crops, but apparently had no effect on cabbage's will to live. The salt draws water out of the cabbage, creating a brine, and in that oxygen-starved brine, lactic acid bacteria take over, converting sugars into lactic acid. That acid is what gives sauerkraut its sour bite, and it's also what makes the cabbage shelf-stable for months, without refrigeration. Sailors on long voyages ate it to prevent scurvy, unknowingly, since nobody understood vitamin C yet. They just knew the crew that ate the cabbage stew didn't lose their teeth. Korea took a similar starting point and built something entirely its own with kimchi, though calling kimchi Korean sauerkraut is the kind of comparison that will get you strong opinions in the comments section. And rightfully so. Kimchi isn't one dish, it's a category, with over 100 documented regional variations, but the most familiar version uses Napa cabbage packed with a paste of gochugaru, garlic, ginger, and fish sauce, or salted shrimp, which adds a savory depth that sauerkraut never attempts. Traditionally, kimchi was buried in clay pots underground, called ongi, where the consistent cool temperature allowed for slow fermentation through the winter months, feeding entire households when nothing was growing above ground. Modern kimchi refrigerators exist purely to replicate that underground temperature stability, which is either a triumph of engineering or an admission that nobody wants to dig a hole in their backyard anymore. Then there's miso, which takes soybeans and, through the introduction of a mold called koji, Aspergillus oryzae, transforms them into a paste so umami-dense it can carry an entire dish on its own. Koji is doing something genuinely wild here. It produces enzymes that break down the soybeans' proteins and starches, essentially pre-digesting them into amino acids and sugars, which is why miso tastes less like beans and more like the concentrated essence of savory itself. Japan didn't invent fermented soybean paste. That credit likely goes to China. But Japan refined it into an art form with regional styles ranging from the pale, sweet shiro miso aged for weeks to the deep, almost chocolate-colored hacho miso aged for years. And the same koji mold responsible for miso is also responsible for soy sauce, sake, and mirin, which means a huge portion of Japanese cuisine's flavor foundation traces back to one very industrious fungus that most people have never heard of. Dairy has its own fermentation story, and cheese deserves its own separate episode entirely. So let's talk about yogurt instead, which might be the most globally widespread fermented food that nobody thinks of as exotic anymore. Bacteria cultures, typically Lactobacillus bulgaricus and Streptococcus thermophilus, consume the lactose in milk and produce lactic acid, which thickens the milk's proteins into that familiar tang and texture. The name itself comes from Turkish, and the practice likely originated somewhere in Central Asia or the Middle East thousands of years ago, probably by accident. Milk carried in animal skin pouches in warm climates, fermenting faster than anyone intended. Bulgaria became so associated with yogurt that the bacteria strain literally carries the country's name, and a Bulgarian scientist named Stamen Grigorov gets credit for first isolating it in 1905. 100 years after Bulgarians had already been eating it for centuries, and presumably wondering what took science so long to catch up. Across the ocean, before Europeans arrived, Andean communities were fermenting potatoes into something called chuño, a preservation method still practiced in Peru and Bolivia today. Potatoes are left outside during freezing nights and then trampled by foot during the day to squeeze out moisture. A repeated cycle that, combined with natural fermentation, can preserve the potato for years, even decades, at extremely high altitudes where little else grows reliably. It's a technique built entirely around scarcity and unpredictable weather. And it worked so well that chuño became a currency in the Inca Empire, meaning your ancestors may have quite literally been paid in fermented potatoes. No conversation about fermentation avoids alcohol for long, and beer might be the oldest fermented product humans deliberately engineered rather than stumbled into. Yeast, wild or cultivated, consumes the sugars in malted grain and produces alcohol and carbon dioxide as byproducts. And evidence from Mesopotamia suggests brewing may predate written language itself, which raises the uncomfortable but fun possibility that humans figured out how to get drunk before we figured out how to write it down. Wine follows the same basic yeast logic, using grape sugars instead of grain starches. And the specific yeast strains, wild versus cultivated, natural versus lab-selected, are still one of the most contested topics in winemaking circles, right up there with oak barrels and vintage snobbery. And then there's the fermented food most people eat daily without a second thought. Coffee and chocolate both go through fermentation before they ever become a drink or a bar. Coffee cherries are pulped and left to ferment for anywhere from 12 hours to several days, a process that breaks down the mucilage surrounding the bean and significantly affects the final flavor profile, meaning that fruity, funky, or clean cup you're drinking was shaped by bacteria and yeast long before it ever saw a roaster. Cacao beans undergo something similar, fermenting in their pulp for up to a week, developing the precursor compounds that eventually become chocolate's complex flavor during roasting. Skip fermentation on either one, and you get something bitter, flat, and nothing like what ends up in your cup or your candy bar. What's strange? Looking across all of this, cabbage in Korea, soybeans in Japan, potatoes in the Andes, grapes in the Mediterranean, is that none of these cultures were fermenting food because they'd read a paper on lactic acid bacteria. They were solving the same problem, keeping food edible through hard seasons, using whatever ingredients their land gave them, and they arrived at solutions that modern food science would later explain but never actually improve on much. The microbes did the same job everywhere. They just had different local ingredients to work with, and the result is a global pantry that runs almost entirely on things humans didn't fully understand until centuries after they started eating them. That's the real through line, isn't it? Every ingredient we've covered on this channel, whether it's salt or rice or mushrooms, turns out to be less about the food itself and more about what happens when humans pay close attention to the world around them and get a little creative with what they're given. Fermentation is just the loudest example, because here, the food is quite literally alive and working while we're not even looking. And maybe that's the best definition of a good kitchen there is. Not a room where you cook things, but a room where you leave the door open just long enough for something interesting to happen.